He prayed in silence. They answered with iron and fire. John Chu Chan was a quiet immigrant laborer, a man who crossed oceans to build a better life, and ended up accused of a crime spoken in a language he barely understood. In the back alleys of California's gold rush towns, suspicion clung to the foreign and unfamiliar. His death was not only unjust, it was a public ritual of degradation, watched by hundreds who didn't know his name. What makes his execution so disturbing is not only its cruelty, but the absolute absence of comprehension. He died in a language foreign to his soul, for reasons whispered behind his back. The boy was born in mud. In the southern reaches of Guangdong, where the rivers fed the paddies with yellow water and mosquitoes bred in swarms thick enough to dim the sun, John Chu Chan's first memory was the sharp tang of rain in flood season and the rasping breath of his mother as she coughed blood into a handkerchief she refused to wash. There was never enough rice, and what they grew often rotted in the field before it could be cut. The villagers whispered of rebels in the north, of conscription, of spirits that visited fevered children at night and left them blue by morning. But John grew quiet, obedient, tireless, a shadow under the sickle, a pair of bare feet planted in black water, a child with nothing to claim but silence. When he was 19, famine came again, heavier than before. This time, the whispers turned outward. The ocean, they said. California. Gold. He sold his father's sharpening stone for a passage on a British chartered freighter, and by the time the money changed hands, it was too late to return. The hold of the ship was a rotting lung of mold, sweat, and seawater. Over 100 men, some boys, some coughing blood into rags, lay wedged in the dark between crates and rats. The food turned sour within days, rice teeming with weevils, water tasting of iron and rot. John slept pressed between a man with open sores on his back and another who muttered in his sleep until he died and was dragged, still twitching, above deck to be tossed into the foam. They wrapped him in a tarp they would later use again. No one spoke of it. 46 survived. When John stepped onto the pier at San Francisco in the spring of 1851, his face was the color of ash and his fingernails were split down to the quick. He blinked at the buildings as if they might vanish in sunlight. What followed was work, not gold, not luck. He was hired to wash linens for miners who never looked him in the eye. He scrubbed their blood from wool, their vomit from collars, their piss from sheets stiff with stains, and he never spoke back when they mocked his bowed head or pulled the corner of their eyes into slits when he passed. When a cart rolled over his foot, breaking 2 toes, he kept working. When a man threw hot lye at him for being too slow, he returned the next day without complaint, the blisters crusting yellow down his neck. He ate alone. Slept in the laundry's attic. Was called John Chinaman, then simply Chinaman, then nothing. They did not fear him. They did not pity him. They did not remember him. Until the girl. She was 13, white, the daughter of a local shopkeeper. Found at the edge of the ravine with her hands bound and her skull broken like a dropped bowl. No one saw who did it. But a search was called, torches lit, and doors kicked in. One man swore he had seen a yellow face walking nearby, another said he heard a strange voice humming. That was enough. They found John crouched in the back room of the laundry, folding a blood-stained shirt. It wasn't her blood, it belonged to a miner knifed in a card game 3 nights prior. But blood was blood, and his hands were red, and his face unreadable. When they shouted at him, he didn't move. When they dragged him out, he didn't fight. And when they told him, in words he didn't understand, that he was accused of murder, he only bowed his head, not in guilt, but in incomprehension. The crowd that gathered outside the jail did not care what he knew or didn't. A foreigner had been found with blood on his fingers, and a white girl was in the ground. The equation was simple. The priest called for mercy. The sheriff called for order. But the townspeople called for the rope, and their voices drowned everything else. John spent his final days as he had spent his first, quietly, surrounded by rot. The cell door closed with a sound that felt final, not sharp like iron, but wet, slow, dragging, as though the wood itself had begun to rot from within, unwilling to bear witness again. The hinges groaned, then stopped. After that, there was only the steady drip of moisture from the low ceiling and the squelch of his own steps on the floor, which was neither stone nor earth but something in between, packed clay soaked with urine, blood, and the greenish runoff from the latrine bucket in the corner. There were no windows. Light came from a single oil lantern behind a slotted iron grate outside the bars, its flame fluttering weakly like something trying not to breathe. The air inside the cell was dense, sour, a layered stench of rust, old vomit, mildew, lime powder thick in the cracks like caked ash, and a more intimate reek that clung to John's own skin, sweat fermented in the folds behind his knees, the rot of untreated blisters, the sickly sweet trace of pus blooming under torn calluses. When he first stepped in, he vomited. After 3 days, he stopped noticing. The straw mat was damp before he lay on it and became a living carpet by the end of the first week. Lice nested in the seams of his tunic, tiny white sacs clinging in clusters, pulsing faintly when warm. He scratched until he bled, and still they multiplied, forming black specks that shifted like ash across his arms and collarbone. Once, he tried to shake them loose and the guard watching him slammed the butt of a musket against the bars, grinning when John flinched and raised both hands like a cornered animal. The guard called him Chinaman as if it were a disease and tapped the metal tip of the musket rhythmically against the bars each time John moved. He was fed once a day, if they remembered. The bowl was wooden and cracked, always damp, with a patch of green fuzz growing around the rim. Inside was rice, gray, sticky, sour, and sometimes a scrap of pork, more gristle than meat, marbled with larvae that twitched when warmed by touch. John learned not to chew too long. The water came in a rusted canteen, metal flaking at the lip, warm and tasting of blood. On the 6th day, he woke to find a sore on his ankle had split open during the night. It was circular, rimmed in pale skin, and wept a yellow fluid that glued the blanket to his flesh. When he tried to stand, he saw the wound had turned black at the edges, and the surrounding skin bubbled like boiled leather. The guards looked once, then turned away. No doctor came. At night, the walls moaned. Not loud, but enough, a low, internal groaning, as though the stone itself remembered the sounds of teeth cracking, of men clawing at their chains, of screams swallowed before they reached the door. John did not scream. His voice had shriveled, coiled into a knot in his throat. When he tried to speak, to ask for water, to ask for light, for mercy, his tongue felt too large, swollen by silence, and the sounds he made resembled coughing more than speech. The guards laughed the first time. After that, they ignored him entirely. He began to whisper prayers, not to be saved, he no longer believed that was possible, but to mark the fact that he existed. He prayed not with hope, but with fear, that if he stopped, he might dissolve completely. He whispered names, his mother's, his sister's, even the names of childhood ghosts his village had once feared, the ones that ate sick children in their sleep. Sometimes, he swore he saw them in the dark, crouched in the corners of the cell, their faces smooth and without mouths, watching with the patience of fungus. By the 10th day, he stopped counting. The sore on his leg had swollen to the size of a clenched fist, blackened at the center, hot to the touch. His lips cracked when he breathed. Blood crusted in his nostrils, and one eye refused to open completely. When he closed both, he saw a flickering light, not the lantern. But something colder, farther, like the glow under ice. No one came to speak with him. No interpreter. No priest. Only once did a boy, a new guard, younger than the rest, pause before the bars, a cloth over his mouth, eyes narrowed in something that might have been pity or revulsion. John lifted his hand, slow, broken-fingered, trembling. The boy turned and walked away. It would be another week before the trial. But the sentence had already begun. The courtroom smelled of sweat, old wood, and hot iron, the kind used to seal prison gates and brand horses. Dust floated in the morning light like ash above a battlefield, and the floorboards groaned beneath the boots of men who had come not for justice, but for spectacle. There were no windows open. The room was packed, airless, pulsing with breath and the faint stink of whiskey, chewing tobacco, and dried blood. It was not the place for truth. It was the place where judgment had already happened, and now waited to be spoken aloud. John Chu Chan was brought in by 2 deputies who kept their gloves on and refused to touch his skin directly, gripping instead the frayed collar of his shirt as though hauling a sack of meat to slaughter. His limp had worsened overnight, the wound on his leg seeping through the bandages he'd torn from the straw mattress. One foot dragged behind him, swollen twice its size. The shackles around his wrists bit deep into old scabs. When he was made to sit, he did not look at the crowd, only at the floor, where a fly circled something black and crusted. The murmurs began before the first name was called. Slit her throat, they say. Ritual murder. That's how they do it in the Orient. Heard he boiled her heart. None of it reached John in full. The words twisted in the air like wine through broken shutters, loud but meaningless. What he saw were faces, tight, sunburnt, dripping with sweat, eyes narrowed not in confusion but in certainty. A child sitting on her mother's knee clutched a rag doll by the throat. The preacher from the local chapel sat stiffly in the front row, lips moving in silent prayer, one hand gripping a crucifix so tightly the knuckles had gone bone white. The prosecutor was red-faced and loud, pointing often, pacing like a showman, his finger jabbing through the air as if to stab John directly. He spoke of savagery, of unnatural appetites, of a race unfit for Christian civilization. He held up the girl's dress, stained, torn, stiff with dried blood, and tossed it onto the judge's bench like a challenge. The jury did not flinch. One of them, a butcher, smiled. The interpreter was an old man, half-deaf, speaking a coastal dialect that barely brushed the corners of John's Cantonese. He translated only scraps, murder, child, rope, before giving up entirely, shrugging at the bench with a vague murmur of, "He doesn't seem to deny." No one questioned it. When the first witness took the stand, a farmer who had once seen John walking near the gully 2 days before, the courtroom erupted in murmurs. The second claimed she had heard foreign singing from the ravine. The third did not speak at all, only held up a scrap of yellow fabric she insisted was from one of them. John sat unmoving, sweat trailing in slow rivulets down his neck, pooling at the collar of his shirt. He blinked once when the judge leaned forward and asked if he had anything to say. He looked to the interpreter, who muttered something unintelligible. John opened his mouth, but no sound came. Not because he refused, but because he no longer trusted his own voice to be recognized as human in this place. The sentence was spoken without pause. Guilty of murder in the first degree. Execution by hanging, at dawn in 2 days' time. Someone in the gallery clapped. A woman near the door spat on the floor and muttered a verse from Revelation about beasts and plagues. That night, in his cell, a deputy entered with a length of rope and mimed the motion, arms up, loop over the neck, head jerked sideways with a snap. He chuckled as he did it. John nodded once. Not in consent. Not in understanding. But because there was nothing left to answer with. The fly from the courtroom had followed him back to the cell. It circled above his head and landed on his lip. He did not brush it away. The sound of the cart was the first thing he heard, a broken groan of wood on iron wheels, each rotation rasping like breath through rotted lungs. Dawn had not yet broken, but the air already hung thick with heat and dust, sour with livestock and tobacco smoke. When the guards hauled him up by the elbows, his legs folded beneath him like damp rope. They swore, dragged him upright, and shoved him toward the open cell door, where the first rays of morning bled through like old bruises in the fog. They had not allowed him to wash. His skin bore the imprint of the mattress straw, the lice, the sores, the nights of fever sweat that soaked through rags and dried against him like layers of salt. His tunic, once beige, now hung in strips, crusted with yellow and brown, the sleeves damp at the cuffs where his wrists bled from the shackles. Each jolt of the chain sent a sharp pressure up his arm, a sensation no longer of pain, but of distant, muffled memory, the way one feels a limb after it's gone numb. They hoisted him into the cart without ceremony. His head struck the wooden plank as he fell, and something burst open above his ear. The crowd winced, not from pity, but from the splash of dark fluid that followed, trailing a slick line down his jaw. A child near the front let out a bark of laughter, echoed by a cluster of boys holding apples gone soft with rot. One of them threw, and the fruit exploded against John's shoulder with a wet slap. The guard said nothing. One of them leaned back against the wheel and smoked, eyes half-lidded, as if bored by the weight of the body beside him. The cart creaked forward. Main Street was already full, lined with townsfolk who had risen early to witness what had been promised for weeks, the death of the outsider, the cleansing of the blood-soaked ground. Women clutched rosaries in one hand and their children with the other, whispering scripture as John passed, as though afraid his shadow might settle into their clothes. An old man held a sign nailed to a broken handle, "Justice for Innocence." Beneath it, someone had scrawled in coal, "Send them back." His cough had worsened in the night. It came in waves now, dry, then wet, then gasping, and each spasm brought up more of the grayish mucus that coated his lips and chin. He wiped it away with the back of his hand, only to smear it deeper into the sores along his jawline. His chest rattled like rusted chain mail with each breath, and when he tried to sit upright, a pain bloomed behind his eyes, hot and white. A woman threw a cabbage. It struck his temple with a thud, rebounded, and rolled into the gutter. The impact opened the wound again, and blood mixed with phlegm in his beard. The laughter that followed was sharp and sudden, not joyous, but thrilled, like a crowd at a hanging dogfight. A few gasped at the sight of him, not because he was dying, but because his body had already begun to resemble something not entirely human: sunken eyes, skin stretched too thin, lips cracked like overfired pottery. One boy, perhaps 10, walked beside the cart with a placard hung around his neck that read, "Murderer." He smiled the whole way. At the edge of the square, the cart slowed. The crowd tightened, pressing inward like a living wall. The scaffold loomed above, pale with soaked at the joints from old rains, its grain dark with stains that no longer had names. The noose hung like an accusation. When John saw it, he did not scream. His knees buckled, his head lolled forward, and his mouth opened, not in protest, but in a final, slow exhale, as though something had left him for good. The guards yanked him up again, one by each arm, fingers digging into the wet fabric of his sleeves. His feet dragged across the earth, leaving 2 faint trenches in the dust. The crowd fell into silence. Even the coughing stopped. A priest stepped forward, his robe stiff with starch, eyes lowered. He held up a Bible and began to read in English, voice trembling slightly as though uncertain of the ritual's worth. John stood motionless. He did not recognize the words. He did not try to. But when the priest bowed his head, John closed his eyes, not in prayer, but in a final gesture of disappearance, a return inward, to a place where language could no longer reach. The sun breached the edge of the roofline, and the shadow of the noose fell across his face. The noose was already swaying when they brought him up. Tied high and thick, the rope hung from the gallows beam like the intestine of something older than law, slick with the oil of many hands and the dust of many dawns. It had been used before. The fibers stank of mildew, dried sweat, old leather grease, and the faint, bitter residue of urine from men whose bodies had betrayed them in their final seconds. When the hood was pulled down over John's face, it clung for a moment, moist, heavy, and cold, before settling like a cowl of rotting linen. The smell inside was intimate: mold, vomit, and something else, something worse, the coppery ghost of another man's scream absorbed long ago and never washed out. He made no sound. Beneath the scaffold, the crowd had shifted. What began as excitement now trembled on the edge of something else, not fear, but discomfort, a communal stiffness, as if the air itself had grown reluctant to carry what came next. Mothers lifted children onto crates to see better, whispering instructions not meant for small ears. A man with a butcher's apron chewed a plug of tobacco in slow, deliberate motions, his eyes fixed on the platform with the focus of someone inspecting livestock. Somewhere behind the crowd, a preacher continued murmuring psalms under his breath, the words muffled and directionless. John stood motionless, a swollen shadow against the rising light. His legs shook once, briefly. Then the floor opened. But the drop was shallow, too shallow, and instead of the clean, swift crack the crowd expected, there came a dull thud, followed by the grotesque creak of straining rope and the wet gasp of a body refusing to die. His feet scraped against the edge of the trapdoor, nails tearing away from skin, toes curling and twitching like the legs of a gutted insect. His bladder released, soaking his trousers in a sudden dark bloom that spread with unbearable clarity down both legs, pooling at the edge of the platform. The hood fluttered with each convulsion, rising slightly as his jaw snapped shut, then open again, the tongue lolling into the cloth like a worm from fruit. Blood began to leak from his nose, not in a gush, but in 2 steady, glistening lines that ran along his upper lip and vanished beneath the hood. A stain grew around the knot in the rope, creeping slowly outward as capillaries in his neck burst under the impossible tension. His body swayed not like a pendulum, but like a fish dragged against the current, erratic, spasmodic, desperate. It lasted 8 minutes. Possibly more. By the 3rd, the laughter had stopped. A boy near the front turned pale and gripped his mother's dress. The preacher had gone silent. A woman in the second row muttered something about demons and crossed herself 3 times. Only the sheriff stood firm, arms folded, eyes fixed forward with the stern, deliberate neutrality of a man defending the mechanics of justice, even as its soul slipped through the cracks. When the twitching finally ceased, when the last faint shudder passed through the feet like wine through dead grass, the platform held still. A fly buzzed near the knot. Another followed. By the time a third appeared, John's hands had already gone black at the fingertips. The priest approached. He lifted his stole with trembling fingers and reached toward the body, but before he could touch the hood, the sheriff barked a sharp command. "Leave him." There was no reply. The priest stepped back, his stole still raised like an unanswered offering. The crowd began to disperse, not in waves of conversation or closure, but in pockets of silence, each group carrying a different expression, some confused, some ashamed, others hardened into thin, unyielding smirks. A girl wept quietly as her brother pulled her away. The boy with the "murderer" placard had disappeared. By noon, the flies had claimed the face, the armpits, and the wet line between the shoulder blades. The sun climbed, unbothered. And the rope, still twitching from the heat, seemed to breathe on its own. They left him hanging until the sun had burned through the last trace of morning haze, until the smell of open flesh began to rise from beneath the hood like steam off butchered meat, until the flies no longer circled, they fed. His head lolled at an unnatural angle, the neck swollen, rope tightened, rope burned to a ring of purpling skin that cracked with every breeze. His hands had turned a darker shade than his wrists, the blood trapped, soured, unmoving, and his legs, once twitching in air, now hung completely still, swollen at the joints, the ankles soaked in whatever fluids had leaked downward in death. By mid-afternoon, the children who had laughed that morning refused to look up. A few vendors, still stationed along the square with baskets of apples and cloth dolls, had drawn their carts further down the road, muttering that the stench ruined business. A dog wandered near the scaffold and whined softly before trotting away. The body had become not just a spectacle, but a warning, a relic of punishment whose message had rotted faster than the man himself. No one came to retrieve him. No family stepped forward. No friend, no countryman, no consulate clerk or sympathetic stranger, only the crows, circling in slow, reverent spirals, hesitant but hungry. By dusk, even they seemed to sense the indecency of it. The undertaker was summoned reluctantly, a broad-shouldered man with yellowed gloves and a pale kerchief tied over his face. He did not speak as he climbed the scaffold. The wood groaned beneath his weight and the rope creaked again, a final complaint. The undertaker sliced through the knot with a rusted knife and let the body drop like waste into a half-covered wheelbarrow below. It landed with a wet thud, limbs splayed unnaturally, one hand striking the rim hard enough to split the skin at the knuckle. The priest was nowhere to be seen. They carted him to the edge of the cemetery, not where the crosses stood, but beyond the fence line, where the ground dipped and the grass refused to grow. He was buried not beside men, but beside animals, a nameless grave between the bones of a rabid dog and the shallow mound of an unclaimed infant. No stone. No marker. Just the hiss of lime as it met the open wound at his throat, and the slow crumbling of a life made flesh, now stripped to meat. The death register listed him only as Chinese male, approximate 30, suspected murderer, executed by hanging, July, 1851. No surname. No village. No one to correct the record. Over time, his story blurred into rumor, a passing tale told by old men at saloons, reduced to a single phrase, that Chinaman who got hanged. The murder remained unsolved. The ravine swallowed the memory of the girl. The court records were lost in a fire 15 years later. But sometimes, on certain nights, when the wind blew from the east and the church bell rang late by mistake, a few townsfolk swore they heard something behind the scaffold, a cough, a gasp, the creak of rope. Others claimed the soil behind the cemetery never quite settled, no matter how many times it was turned. One boy dug there once and came home with a sickness no doctor could name. And still, no one spoke his name, not because they forgot, but because they never knew it. John Chu Chan's death sparked no riots, no inquiries. But in the decades that followed, his execution became a footnote in the growing debate around anti-Chinese violence in the American West. As lynchings and exclusions grew more frequent, some looked back at his case as the beginning of a pattern, one where guilt was presumed by skin alone. His grave was never marked. But his name, once misspelled and forgotten, is now archived in records of wrongful executions. A symbol not of justice, but of how a system deaf to language can become fluent in cruelty.